Bien, bonjour à tous. Je voudrais dire qu'on est extrêmement heureux de recevoir aujourd'hui dans cette école Albert Pope, qui est architecte enseignant à l'université de Rice à Houston, la capitale américaine du pétrole, et qui... alors moi, on s'est rencontrés il y a juste 5 ans à peu près, à Houston une fois. Mais j'ai beaucoup entendu avant parler de Albert Pope par mes meilleurs amis qui s'étonnaient que je n'ai toujours pas lu alors son livre paru en 1997, Ladders. J'ai longtemps cherché à me procurer une copie de Ladders, mais c'était out of print pendant longtemps. Jusqu'en 2015 où le Princeton Press, I think, a republié, a fait une seconde édition de ce livre que j'ai pu lire à ce moment-là. Et je voudrais simplement dire que j'ai eu, en lisant alors ce livre, le sentiment d'avoir affaire à l'un des livres les plus importants qui ait été écrit, en tout cas depuis le milieu de l'architecture, sur l'histoire des villes et des formes urbaines depuis la Seconde Guerre mondiale. J'en dirai pas plus là-dessus. Je pense qu'il en dira peut-être quelques mots, je ne sais pas. Mais je pense qu'il faudrait, toutes affaires cessantes, et si personne ne le fait, il faudra qu'on s'en occupe, faire traduire enfin ce livre en français. Depuis de nombreuses années, Albert Pope a placé la problématique du changement climatique au cœur de ses préoccupations. Et son travail d'architecte et de recherche porte maintenant sur la façon dont il va falloir adapter la production, les modes de production de la ville à cette question centrale du changement climatique. C'est donc de cela qu'il va parler ici aujourd'hui. Donc, Albert, we really thank you for coming here today. Juste après sa conférence, la conférence va durer environ 1 heure, on gardera un petit temps de questions. Et puis ensuite, il faudra qu'on vous demande, en tout cas tous ceux qui sont dans la première partie de la salle, de sortir un moment, si vous voulez revenir après, pour la soutenance de la HDR qui se tiendra dans la demi-salle ici. Voilà, donc je vous demanderai après la fin de la conférence de bien vouloir aller assez vite parce qu'on a un programme, surtout pour moi, assez chargé aujourd'hui. Albert, that's your turn.
Thank you for that introduction that I did not understand, but I'm sure it was wonderful. And can you hear? Is this better? Does this work? Okay. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm sorry I can't speak to you in French. It would be a mess. But I will try to enunciate clearly to make it a little bit easier. Essentially what I would like to do is I have the first 15 slides, which are really about theory and about positioning the city in the context of the problems that we have today, as well as in the context of the discipline, by which I mean modern urbanism, in order to try to think those two things together. And then the second part, which is the bulk of the slides, but I'll go through them really quickly, are 2 projects, design projects at a large scale that attempt to apply some of the theory. Perhaps not an absolutely direct connection between the two, but enough of one that I think you can understand that the application, the sort of instrumentalization of the ideas is what I think is at stake. That we take the work that we do here in school. And the thinking that we do, and we provide a vehicle for pushing it out into the world. It makes me a sort of amateur theorist and an amateur designer right? I don't have a foot in, really a substantial foot in either camp. But I do think the attempt to straddle those two worlds, however awkward it may be, is what we need to be undertaking, given the situation that we're in. And the situation that we're in, since this slide has been up for the last 20 minutes, you probably had a look at it, is related to the environmental crisis we have. When I'm speaking about the environmental crisis, I'm really speaking about not just climate change and the problem of carbon in the atmosphere, which is perhaps the most pressing issue. Species extinction, I think, is a huge part of that. Ocean acidification, the damage we're doing to the landscape. It's a large-scale crisis that we're facing that goes beyond the climate. But as a start in climate, I think these three numbers, which you may know or you may have already read them, were really instrumental in turning my my head in the direction of this larger project that I'm going to talk about. And that is the 2 degrees, which you've probably heard. It's the Paris Accords were targeted at 2 degrees. They were talking about 1.5, but the limit to which we want to keep surface warming before really bad, we have really bad consequences. The second one is our budget within that 2-degree limit. If we accept it, which everyone has, that budget is 565 gigatons left that we can put into, continue to put into the atmosphere and stay within that surface warming. And then the kicker of the 3, which is what it's really about, is that there's the fossil fuel industry has within their reserves, there's proven reserves, which is the amount of energy that they are proven resources is 3,000 gigatons, which is 5 times the number that will put us over 2 degrees of surface warming. Right? And I think because that number is tied into the economic, our economic apparatus, that we can talk about a carbon bubble in the economy. And we can talk about stranded assets that obviously and clearly those reserves, that 3,000 gigatons, has to stay in the ground, right? Which is a tall order, given the economic situation, especially in the United States. I should say at the outset that this is more of an Americo-centric presentation and problem that I'm presenting, but I will try to translate it more directly where it maybe is not quite applicable. I don't know if you mentioned that Rice is where I teach, is in Texas. That tells you a lot. If you know anything about the United States, you know that Texas is the most conservative, most primitive and right-wing part of the United States, which makes it a real, and it also happens to be the energy capital, the carbon capital of the United States and partially of the world, which makes this an especially interesting place and time to be making an argument like this. It's why I tied it to the economics. If cities that we also know to take the next leap, I want to grapple with this problem, but I want to grapple with it in disciplinary terms. In other words, I'm not interested in being an activist. I'm not interested in being an economist, although it may be really helpful. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm an architect, and I'm an urban designer. and I have to do my job, which is my response to this situation is not to do something else besides design, but it is in fact to find out what it means to us within the discipline and how we incorporate it into the priorities that we have about the design of the built environment. So the connection that we can make is an obvious one. Cities account for 2/3 of the world's overall energy consumption and 70% of greenhouse emissions, which pretty much puts the city on the front line of any attack, any battle, any confrontation with the climate problem. And the simple question that we ask ourselves is, what would a city with a 75% per capita reduction in energy consumption look like? The missing piece of information there is that in the United States, in order to get close to a world average, which would bring us to keep us below this 2 degrees of warming, the United States has to, the per capita consumption in the United States has to be cut by 75%. That's about the time when I'm speaking in Texas that people start leaving the room, because that's an incredible number, right? How do you even get your head around a 75% reduction? That's where the question comes from. What would a city with a 75 per capita reduction in energy consumption look like? That's something that we can do as designers. Yeah, I can give you that number and you can freak out, you can do whatever you want, but that's just a number. I think one of the things we can do is translate that number into, in this case, environmental terms, right? What would the city look like? Maybe if we understand it by seeing an environment, presenting an environment, we'll be able to better understand the problem in its full dimensions and understand potentially that this problem has a solution. So this is Houston, and in all its ugly glory. It's also, I think, a very interesting. I look at this world, which I've lived in for 30 years. In somewhat of a detached state that has largely to do with the fact that I know a lot about cities. I know a lot about urban dispersion and how it was the foundational aspiration of modern urbanism, from the English Garden City to the constructivist disurbanist proposals to Broadacre City. One of the biggest solutions to industrialization and the problems of industrialization was dissipation, urban dissipation, as a progressive response to the overcrowding, the decline of living conditions in the industrial city, as you just explode the city out. It was proposed in the 20s as a fantastic possibility, and certainly a response to industrialization and a response to the First World War. But after the Second World War, it became came to be embraced and came to be realized. Very close, in fact, in terms. And you can see that this is a 20-lane highway. This is called the Energy Corridor, which is where all the energy companies are housed. Down the center of town, which is really an office park, right? It's a Houston, because it's so new, has single-use zoning. So it's mostly office spaces that you see in the top, but since much more spread out in a linear fashion, just like the linear cities that we studied in history. So there's this historical aspect to it, which I've always appreciated, but there's also the problem of energy consumption, which is a vertical axis, and then the dissipation, which is the horizontal axis. And you have Houston, Phoenix on the top. You have European cities clustered down here, and you have wonderful Hong Kong sitting at the opposite, polar opposite end. This is clearly the problem. The city is not going to take us into the future by any measure because of the extraordinary per capita consumption of energy, which you can see in the table at the top. The bright white line at the top is the per capita consumption in the United States as a whole. You see European cities and actually Japan running in the middle of the diagram. And you see Hong Kong, because it is classified as a country, it gets set up within this graph. It's a World Bank graph. And the world average, and China, which, as you know, is still largely rural, so has a very low footprint. The situation as I read it and the way that I incorporate it into the world of urban design is to say that density is a kind of no-brainer. It's obvious, it's an obvious almost solution that we could drop. If you look at, especially at Hong Kong, which is the only modern city that really exists at the level that would keep us at 2 degrees of surface warming. It is almost a situation where you could say if we are able in the next building cycle to build our cities at a greater density, the problem is solved, surprisingly. It's obviously not so easy to do, but the impact of density on energy consumption is proven. It's established. It's not just because of mass transportation. It's also about fewer but larger buildings that have a decreased amount of surface area. It's about the fact that people who live in dense urban environments don't have big garages and closets to store a lot of shit in, so you don't buy it to begin with. Density is a more comprehensive approach to thinking through our habits of energy consumption. So it's where we enter the dialogue, and it's where we start having the problem. If we wanted in the United States, and actually here, to move from that middle level to the bottom level, which is where we have to get in this graph, we have to build more density. The problem, especially acute in the United States, is we haven't built dense in 60, 70 years. This is our last shot at it, which was Manhattan. Manhattan overlays the energy statistics of Manhattan overlays the energy statistics of Hong Kong. The average footprint of someone who lives on the island of Manhattan has this 75% reduction in energy consumption relative to the rest of the country. It gives you that counterintuitive result, which is that the grayest cities are the greenest, right? The densest cities are the ones that have the smallest footprint, which I think is oftentimes a hard sell, especially in the United States, for people who are environmentally oriented and more or less imagine cities that allow them to directly commune with the natural environment, the natural world. However, I think we're on a different footing now with regards to our environmental problems, and we've sort of cashed in on thinking through the problem in terms of density as, if not the solution, certainly one of them. So the graph at the top, you may remember, it's from, it showed up in 2 places. When the cathedrals were white, 1935, Corbusier drew this, I redrew the diagram, but that's the diagram he drew of New York. And then it showed up again in a very different context in Delirious, New York. And what it's showing is the progression of Manhattan from this low-scale block and street infrastructure to what Corbusier imagined was this chaos of high-scale buildings, that big, large-scale in this mat of very low-scale buildings, and the mess that ensued in terms of traffic, circulation, et cetera. And obviously Corbusier's solution, which is the radiant city, which is really where we have to rejoin the story of building urban density. Is back at the radiant city model. The idea that we could do something like Manhattan, meaning lay out a grid of relatively small blocks and just throwing buildings on top of it in every possible, that's not an idea, that's not a model of dense urban development. What the radiant city tried to do was to say that if you have density, it has to go along with open space. The two go hand in hand, and any model that you have is going to produce an equal, greater amount of open space in order to counteract the density. It just so happens that New York has these wonderful rivers on either side, so it has a void, surrounded by a void, which makes the density work. But to think that through as a model is what we need to do again today. Where are we in terms of density? So where we are, I grabbed these three different images, which drive me kind of nuts for the same reasons, although they're very different. One of them is a project by OMA in Dubai, Waterfront City. None of these have been, the top two haven't been built, the bottom one has. The second is the zero carbon Masdar City, Foster's and Partners. It started and stopped. And then the bottom one is the Daimler Platz, which is the rebuilding of the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin by Renzo Piano. And there are a couple of things I can just quickly say about this approach to producing density today. The first thing has to do with the fact that these are all super blocks, all built at one time, single developer, single architect, and they are imitations of an aggregate urbanism, right? They're pictures of the way we used to build cities, or we built cities when these the models were actually in use, in active use, where we aggregated a city piece by piece. We didn't master plan a composition. We laid out a grid and went through a process of aggregation that had some restricting rules. And what we seem to be, the best we seem to be able to do today is just copy what that aggregate structure looked like. So these were not buildings that were built at different time. These are all built at once, right? They're supposed to look like buildings that grew at different times in different places. Same with the Masdar, same with this Cité-esque, Camillo Citté's revival of more medieval urban design qualities and characteristics directly applied in the reconstruction of Potsdamer Platz. So they're super blocks that are, I don't mind that they're super blocks, I mind that they're producing a picture of something else, something that they're incompatible with. The second thing that bugs me about them, especially the bottom two, is that these are Norman Foster and Renzo Piano built a reputation on being the most cutting edge, the most technologically progressive architects in the world. And that technology was the source of their representation. That's what they used to make their buildings communicate, beginning with the Centre Pompidou. Okay, so here we have two of the most technically advanced architects in the world employing atavistic urban models. The one in the case of Foster, it's inspired by the architecture and urban planning of traditional Arab cities. Masdar City incorporates narrow streets, the shading of windows, exterior walls, thick-walled buildings, courtyards, and wind towers. You could ask Norman Foster as a disciple of Buckminster Fuller how much his city weighs. Same with Piano. with its surface area of 600,000 square meters, the scheme has the dimensions of a small town. And like a village, it's designed around a piazza, the focal point of the project. Why is it, or can we stop to consider why you would be using an architectural frame of reference which is advanced, which is progressive, which is technical, in the service of atavistic urban models who have not been in use or in play for hundreds of years. And it's that split between the architecture and the urbanism, which was really one of the promises of modern architecture, is that we could combine those two things, that there is a continuity between architecture and urbanism, that architecture is meaningless without a direct connection to the city in which it was conceived. That I have a problem with the projects. In Manhattan, we haven't built Manhattan in 50 years. We can't. Relative to the scale of the market economy today, the Manhattan block is a non-starter. These are old models that are applied to new forms. If I'm going to try to address that situation, and to say, is there a contemporary model? Is there a contemporary urban logic that we could relate to as opposed to a Mediterranean souk or a medieval village square? What would that be? How do we define it? And Sebastian mentioned my book Ladders, which is basically, I'm a broken record on the subject, that we have changed in the 1950s, after 1950, after the massive transformations of industry in the Second World War, we transformed our urbanism. Before the war, we had a continuity of grids. Those grids might have been cranked or curved or, they might have been orthogonal, but there was a continuity of the urban fabric. After the war, as beginning in 1950, it's very clear in the United States. This is a little, the United States cities are a lot like diagrams, so it's easy to find. This is a cul-de-sac subdivision of a series of houses that is employing a spine form. So oftentimes we think we're living in this world up here, and this is in the United States, which is a normal city of blocks and streets, and that's what urbanism is. When in fact, we're actually living in this, where that original extent of continuous development has been halted, just like the Périphérique in Paris. Exactly, Houston has a loop which stops at 1950, like a tree ring, outside of which you have discontinuous development, again, like Paris, right? A series of isolated, more enclave-driven structures that I identify with the form of the spine or the ladder. We have not a grid-based, but a spine-based urban development, and that changes everything. The spine is not a subset of the grid. It is a completely different animal, not only which the case is that by now in the United States, 25% of the city is what we call urban, blocks and streets, and 75% is what's outside. That is not unlike Paris, where there are 2 million people living inside the Périphérique, and what, 8 to 10 outside? That's 20% in this world, and 80% in this world. I can tell you that in my school, all of the projects we do are in here. Drives me up the wall. It's the argument that I have that this is a 25% urbanism, right? If you're going to look at if you do projects just inside the Périphérique, or just inside, in the case of the United States, inside the loop or on the continuous grid, you have a 25% urban project. Not an urban project. An urban project is not 25%. It is the status of the suburb, even in the language, that allows us to dismiss it. But beyond a certain point, what is 75%? You can't dismiss it. It's not sub to anything, right? It's herb, and it's an alter herb, which is really the point that I've spent a good amount of time and a good amount of my career trying to express. I really feel like all of the connection that I started out with, talking about the relationship between between the discipline and the world. I don't think the discipline can exist outside of or apart from what is going on in the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that modernism was born at the moment of directly following the First World War. I don't think it's an accident that modernism was embraced following the Second World War. We track these events. I think climate change is actually one of these events. In the United States, around the world, there's this new word, Anthropocene. You probably heard it. It was a kind of started out as a conceit that we wanted to make a point that we are driving the forces of the planet. That one species, us, are driving the forces of the planet, and that should be codified in the way we think about the geologic age in which we live. And so it was. I can't remember the year. I probably have it written up there somewhere. It was decided that we had entered the Anthropocene, and surprisingly enough, the Geologic Society, which has probably which has to be the most conservative academic society in the world, right? Took it up and immediately started trying to figure out what would be left in the geological record of our world. It was immediately thought, when it was proposed, that you could find in the geological record the traces of carbon. So obviously, we put it at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As they studied it, it became clear that it's not the Industrial Revolution, it is the 1950s. When the economy shifted following the Second World War into mass production and consumption, a consumer economy, everything kicks up. They did this is 8 of 25 analysis, and you can see them yourself. This is the top, I think, is this side is Earth systems, so it's disasters, species extinction, domesticated land, percentage of domesticated land, rainforest. On this side, it's human activity, population, GDP, paper goods, international tourism. Obviously didn't exist before 1950. And they've given it a name, the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration has only become visible in hindsight, but it is very clear that the tables turned, if I can use that expression, at the flashpoint somewhere around 1950 when the consumer economy kicked in. It just so happens that that's precisely the moment in which we transition from a grid-based urbanism into a spine-based urbanism. That in itself is fairly interesting. It still doesn't give us a way to think about this new type of urbanism that we began to produce in 1950. This is how we started to get a handle on it from within the discipline. And the book is heavily invested in this character right here, Ludwig Hilbersheimer. Here's Mies on this side. And almost, he began to think of spine-based development before the Great Acceleration. But most of it came after his immigration to the United States in 1939, and his publications in the early 40s and late 40s, completely anticipating this transformation and actually sublimating it. trying to make it, I mean, part of the relationship between the connection between the economic base and the cultural superstructure. That culture is, in a sense, an attempt to sublimate the economic base, which has no real human dimension to it. Sublimation means civilize, right? Culture has that direct relationship to the economic substrate. In this case, the substrate of the Great Acceleration, which you're right on the verge of right here. In, I think, 1941. And you can imagine it's a fantastic story of Mies and Hilbersheimer sitting at IIT while really the urban fabric collapses around them. The south side of Chicago is a disaster. It's still a disaster if you know it's got an incredible murder rate. And the response to that was to recognize this transformation. And he encapsulated it in this notion of a settlement unit which would replace the block as the unit of urban aggregation. It's actually way bigger in scale. It's in terms of blocks, that one would be 10 blocks, right? But it is the new unit of aggregation to the scale of the new economy. As it turns out, to the scale of the economy and the Great Acceleration. So he, among most of the modern urbanists, he was intensely interested, because I think he was sitting in the middle of this disaster zone in Chicago, in how you solve the problem of urban redevelopment. And this is one of his early schemes for Marquette Park. This is, it's actually a famous park. It's like Central Park, a little Century Park. It was actually designed by Olmsted Brothers. And his transformation of that in a series of stage sequences, we started to pull out intersections. It's a demolition diagram, basically, of how you transform a city, how you control in what was occurring in the 1950s, which was this incredible dispersion out, this horizontal extension that I was talking about before, into the landscape. That would obviously affect the city itself. And what it gives you is, you know, I show this, and on one hand, people shudder, right? You're actually doing this to a grid. You're actually turning it in to a cul-de-sac subdivision. But again, if we pull back and think of it from a disciplinary perspective, you know that one of the most important aspects of modern urbanism was the incorporation of space, that space is the organizing element of the city, not form. And that we have an idea of space here which is perfectly framed and has edges, to an idea of space here which is a continuous and is a medium in which the city is placed, in which it exists. They're translating the idea of space that is more accommodating to the problems of urbanism in the 20th century. That the problems of density, but not just density, our alienation from the landscape, mechanical production of grids, right? All of this was alleviated by a new notion of space. And here Hilbersheimer is already in 1941, displaying it on the wall of his studio. So I'm not going to go through this. This is in the book. This comes from the book. It's just a sort of capsulization of the argument, which talks about how different spine-based urbanism is from grid-based urbanism. The most obvious distinction is at the top, where you have the same scale and you see the small dots, the small circles. When you're on a grid, mathematicians tell me that if you connected 13 of those small circles on the grid, there'd be almost an infinite number of connections that you could move around the grid, right? When you turn that into spine-based organization, there's only exactly and precisely one connection between point A and point B. Right? We're talking about a very different type of organizational animal. It looks kind of like a grid, especially if you draw it orthogonal, but its performance, its organizational logic could not be more different. That carries through in its social dimension and in its form. There is one part which I think I can is talking about the social dimension and understanding the spine in the larger sense of values that we today and in the 20th century recognize as essential to any urban project, and that is related to this diagram that you see on your right. The route to a specific location in a spine-based urbanism will always terminate in an exclusive destination or endpoint. The route to a specific location is an open and continuous grid. On the other hand, will never terminate because the grid is infinite in all directions. As opposed to the cul-de-sac's termination of movement, the grid offers only a series of stopping points. Arbitrary stopping points that are described as coordinates in space. For example, 239 East 339th Street. That's how we used to build cities, right? It's coordinates in space. The organizational logic of an open grid produces points that are connected in an infinite number of circuits or loops, which I was just showing you. The organizational logic of the cul-de-sac spine produces, on the contrary, a distribution of terminals on the cul-de-sac city. The pattern of movement through urban space traces the figure of a discrete spiral through a succession of the overlaid structural hierarchies, which has its basis in traffic engineering. In the cul-de-sac city, this movement begins on a primary urban freeway and from there turns inward towards a singularly defined center, this in-turning, spiraling path from freeway to feeder to collector to development spine to driveway forms the trajectory of a closed urban system turning inward upon itself. The path configures a series of discrete segments, each more exclusive than the last. Everyone now lives not on an anonymous grid coordinate, but at the end of a particular path on the last driveway, the last cul-de-sac in a city, whose overall form is unknowable. In cul-de-sac urbanism, we are right where we always wanted to be, at the very origin of the spiral, with each of our delicate egos seated at the base of a headlong downward trajectory. We're constructing subjects in a very different way in this world that permeates, as we all do, right, the individual. In other words, it's not just traffic engineering, and it's not, there are a lot of ways to explain the shift from the grid to the spine or the ladder. It is many, many things. I think this is one of the most important ones, is that it registers the shift of values that we have, especially in the United States, from a consolidation, a permeation of collective values to the ultimate value of the individual, defined in a very discrete way. Certainly not as a coordinate, a number on a grid. Right? And the second, I think, following on that logic, we have Hilbersheimer transforming not just cities, not just big cities, but also the region, seeing actually no difference between the two, that you can't change one without the changing the other. There's a back and forth between them. This is his redevelopment of a small town, which is Elkhorn, which is really a regional agricultural city in the upper left-hand side. All of those roads, it's not really drawn correctly, spread out into the fields, into the landscape, and how he envisioned pulling that in, truncating the connection to the region, actually, and attaching it to what became, at the same time, the interstate highway system as a node in a much larger system. We often think of spine-based development, and as associated with, in the United States, we use the term megalopolis, right, where cities grow together into conurbations. But it's not just in big cities. This is how provincial cities in America look, right? We used to have mom and pop stores that existed on Main Street in the center of the town, and we now have Walmart. This is Hilbersheimer's drawing. Walmart, office building. He had industry placed at the bottom. It's a pretty accurate description of what actually happened. This is another version of that, done for a bigger city, Rockford, Illinois. And I think it's even more interesting in the sense that you can see I added the 0 one, which was the original grid. Rockford is a ford in the river, right? A lot of cities are, and especially in the United States, in the Midwest, are based on where the river is passable. The grid was originally oriented to that. And as it grew, it went orthogonal, following the north, south, east, west, and spread out, according to Hilbersheimer, like a stain that was completely indifferent to the environment in which it was spreading out in. What he attempted to do was to transform this very arbitrary organization that had no sense of what it was and where it was to a pattern of development which corresponded to the fact that it was in a river valley. And in a long and linear context, became, let's call it, a kind of organism. I shouldn't go into that. There's a branch of Hilbersheimer related to this thing called organicism, where you start to think of architecture and urbanism as an organism within the natural environment. I think I put it up there. Ecology is simply defined as the analysis of interactions among organisms and their environment. He was seeing the city as an organism within its environment. It's geared and staged within its environment. If the environment is linear, the city is linear. The city, now spine-based, could adjust itself to topography, right? It could, because it had this new spatial dimension, could integrate into the river, the space of the river, right? Open to the river, etc. I think it's really interesting, and it puts us. It's slightly uncomfortable for me because it's, I have hot and cold readings of this. It's horrible and it's kind of fantastic at the same time. So to press on, the last transformation of the spine is the most outrageous one, which initially I didn't take very seriously until I actually started studying it, is that there is a simple 90-degree rotation separates the garden city and the radiant city. That the core and plates of a high-rise development circa 1950 are exactly aligned, if not in scale, certainly in population, right? The same population lives in here that can live in here. And organizational logic. Which brings me full circle back to thinking about density and what density looks like today. One of the places we went to answer that question was actually up there, the terrifying world of Hong Kong housing, mass housing, which we've been studying for the last 3 or 4 years. For scale, that's a 10-story schoolhouse, by the way. These are enormous buildings built within 2 years. They're actually built by different developers, but they're typologically developed, so you can tell. You can't really tell the difference between the architects and developers. I think in general, we can accept the spine as a form of typology, that the world outside the periphery, the world outside of traditional grid and block, street and block urbanism is not what we call it in the United States sprawl. Unorganized, crazy, chaotic. It's actually very organized, sometimes more organized by the spine than the grid ever was. And it's just a matter of recognizing this type, this pattern, to begin to think through an architecture that would relate to it and would connect to it. the connection, again, the connection between architecture and urbanism. So this will be, and I'm finishing the section here with the case studies that we did. There are lots of places you could go. I think it's kind of amazing, although I'm not hearing any of you guys say much positive about it, so I really don't know about the developments outside of the Périphérique in Paris. And what I think is amazing that there's now going to be a loop that connects it all, no longer tied to the center. And the new towns. And the fact that the original new towns are now, their time is over. We have to start replacing buildings in them. Huge problems coming from that because of the size of development, et cetera. But is really stirring a different, the Radiant City is maturing. The Radiant City was really built, given that it was master planned, it was not built as an aggregate. It now has to aggregate. It has to start behaving like a more traditional city, but at this enormous scale. So we went to this place called Sha Tin, which is the first new town in Hong Kong, which has, it's one of the highest densities in all of Hong Kong. It just doesn't have the dense urban spaces. And to see what was going on, how was density done, right? What are you doing? It was kind of amazing. They've been moving, pushing right along. The first thing that got me there, which I think was made the project possible, was the fact that it's built around the canal. You can't really see it. It runs through that panorama, which is what's left over of the bay, which they infilled in order to produce the land, new land for housing. And it's this beautiful void, this perfect rectangle of water that structures the entire organization, which is a notion that came from an OMA project, Mel and Sonar, that you could actually, it makes a lot more sense to organize cities, modern cities, around space rather than form, and that empty space, void space, can be the glue that holds together disparate urban elements. I think it's the real only advancement in urbanism in the second half of is this one project, which actually OMA never followed through on. But we sort of took this as a found version. And it's kind of fantastic because we aren't used to seeing cities that are organized around the void, right? Cities are organized around the solid. Old cities, central business districts, you don't organize a city around the void. This organizes around the void, and because it is a void, the hierarchies are diffused. And all of the housing estates that surround it are no longer dominated by that voided condition. At any rate, not to make a long story short, we're writing a book on this. And this is a housing estate, which we looked at. It's 11,000 units. They built it the site work was 2 years, but the 11,000 units was 2 years. 50% fabricated in Shenzhen and in a warehouse and trucked over the border, such that when we looked at it in construction, the trucks were calculated moving up the roads to the site. It was clockwork, putting these things into place. As you know, Hong Kong has it has a per capita energy consumption that is livable. 5% of the population owns a car. And the 5% that do, I don't think ever drive them. It's mostly services. These are large buildings. I could go on. It's a fantastic experiment. Hong Kong Housing Authority has built 50% of the housing in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong. And the thing that interests me the most about it is that Hong Kong is about as far away from a welfare state as you could get, right? This is not a housing program in Finland. Hong Kong is, if it doesn't pay, it doesn't get built in Hong Kong. It's a city of money. So the conclusion that you have to draw is that it actually pays to build decent environments, right? It wouldn't happen if that weren't the case. Which I think opens up housing to a new dimension. This is that project, and I can tell you I know it's kind of shocking. This is almost a metaphysical landscape of the public terraces that are floating in the middle of this thing. The book we're doing is called On Unique and Typical Forms. One of the distinctions that we make, you know, Hong Kong housing is really recognizable because it's striated, and the reason it's striated is that they have a law that says every single room, including bathrooms, have to have a window, which means that they are paying an enormous amount of money to increase the surface area of these units by the tune of like 50% over this, to get windows in every single room, including the bathrooms. And my friends in Houston say, how can you look at such inhuman stuff? And I just tell them, we put in the United States fixtures in closets and call it a bathroom. We put kitchens in 25 feet away from a window and call that. So you tell me what is inhuman, right? They're just different definitions of it. There's something that is, in this case, more humane. And I can say the units are tiny, but they are spectacular. I've taken three classes of Texans through this thing, and not one of them had a problem of imagining themselves living there. Anyway, this was our attempt to come up to speed to where we are now with density, and return to this question of what would a city that with a 25%, what would a city with a 75% reduction in energy consumption look like in the context of an American city in this case? I'm going to have two projects. This one is in Houston. Both of them are in low-income neighborhoods. Both of them are inside on the grid. That had a lot to do with the funding of the projects. That I could only get. I couldn't get projects. The projects I do don't, number one, they don't have commission. There's no one exists to commission them, so I get them by grants. And the only way to get grants is to go after the grants that are there, and they're almost always about redevelopment. What we were trying to do in this one is to take a depressed area of the city, a horrible area of the city, and redevelop it, at least in the initial stages, in order to get the transformation to a post-carbon environment going. At the same time, trying to figure out how to take care of these substandard houses that exist. The way we enter the planning argument is to recognize the United States, buildings are built to last 50 years, at most. Some houses last more than 50 years, but you're gutting it if you're lasting over 50 years. Commercial buildings are actually amortized on insurance sheets for 25 years, right? And this sounds dreadful. Buildings are supposed to be permanent. On the other hand, can we take advantage of it? Cities are in a cycle. After 50 years, and I think I have it up there, there's a thought experiment. If I went out on the street, got in a time machine, went out on the street 50 years later, over that 50 years, everything around me would have been rebuilt, right? Once you recognize that, you can stand apart and say, did we build what we needed to build, right, in the last 50 years? Given what we know now, has what, in this one building cycle, what we have built responded to what we know? Did we build what we needed to build? Which I think is a good question. I think even a better question for architecture schools is, did we even imagine what we needed to build in that next building cycle? Which was the question of the class. It allowed us to enter into a planning discussion and completely circumvent the tabula rasa problem. They were going to come in and just wipe out a neighborhood. All of our projects are staged, 10-year periods. We're doing one that's shorter now, related to the flood we just had. But these are staged in 10-year periods. There are different constituents for different stages. One of the things we had to put out there on the front end is that there's a second cycle, a small cycle of residency. People, if you combine owning and renting, the average American moves every 5 years. There's another cycle in this. And I use that to argue against community-based planning. Not argue against it, but to say that we have a responsibility not only to the people who exist there now, but to the next generation, the next generation. One generation does not own a city. It's something that's oftentimes, even being clear about it can oftentimes be difficult. So this is the before, and this is the after. And what we've done is within those two big cycles, the building cycle and residency cycle, in the diagram at the top, we've inserted a second cycle, a green cycle, which has to do with the carbon plantations, which you can see surrounding the existing projects inside the bubble, the after bubble. And just to quickly go through this, because I've already been talking an hour, what we were trying to do is put the city into the carbon cycle through the use of wood. Wood as a material. So what you see in the project is essentially a radiant city model that takes its open space and turns that over into carbon plantations. As you know, trees suck carbon out of the air and store it. Wood, we think of wood in lots of different ways, but you know, it's a beautiful material, everyone loves it, apple pie. But you can also think of it as a block of storage. And when you think of wood as a block of storage, you're thinking of wood in a way that we've never thought of wood before, right? For one thing, you want more of it as much as possible. Part of the logic of the system that we have carbon plantations, and what we explored in both of these projects is what you probably heard of, is cross-laminated timber construction. Wood in two different states, doing two different things. And I can show you a little bit more about how we got there. What it does is it puts across the top, you grow the trees, you store the cycle, the wood and the carbon and the wood. You protect the wood by putting it in a building. It's a good way to protect wood. And then you replant the trees. And it's a way to put the city into the carbon cycle. We sidestep the logistical problem of saying you have to cut down a tree and then take that tree and plane it and put it into a building. That's not what it's about. Trees, even in the United States now, you're able to sell carbon sinks to energy companies because they know they're going to need it to offset. But the goal is, as corny as it sounds, is to inhabit the carbon cycle. What we wanted to do was to make a carbon capture and sequestration facility that you also happen to be able to live in, right? At the same time. We'll never be able to afford the outrageous technologies of carbon capture and storage, which is putting the carbon underground. They're really expensive. It's a technical solution. It's a one-off thing. What we need is to solve two problems at one time. The problem of housing, which is acute worldwide, and the problem of carbon. You're not going to do either one of those apart. And this is just the procedure. It can go really quick. The tree covers, the types of trees that we were working with, what would grow there. We had an urban forester who was involved in it. This is the cross-laminated timber construction. If you don't know it, it was invented in Austria because they had a surplus in wood. They started essentially smashing together 1x2s, or what we call 1x2s, into this plywood on steroids that has a remarkable rigidity. And it's a panel system, a self-supporting panel system. And it's incredibly forgiving. I mean, you can punch holes in it, you can, you know, the pattern, the structural pattern, the load patterns can move all over the place depending on what you need to do. And it happens to be a really beautiful material. Our first phase replaced all the shitty houses with the first tower. The second phase started the planting of plantations. The different species were on different timetables for carbon sequestration. I think I have a diagram there that they really peak. We're cutting for carbon. We're not cutting for products, trees for products. We're not cutting for urban forestry. You cut because you have a steep curve up where it's really sucking carbon out of the air and which tapers off as it goes. So you cut at its peak and you replant. And then you take what you've cut and you can turn it into biofuels. You can also turn it into construction materials. This is a little bit showing carbon, the panel system. It's incredibly quick. This is a project by Andrew Waugh, the first really tall building, even though it was 10 stories in London. And what we were, this is more of the same. And what we were after is what we have, it's sitting on a bayou, which is a specific kind of river that we have in Houston, which you probably heard flooded in the last month. We have rewilded the bayous. We're proposing to rewild the bayous, which incidentally are all in the public domain, all 150 miles of them, and are looking at wood in its wild state in the bayous. We're looking at wood in its cultivated state in the carbon plantations, and we're looking at wood in its most refined and domesticated state in these high-rise wood construction, cross-laminated wood construction. The three states of the material describe a kind of material culture, right? We've seen, historically, you see a lot of, you know, I guess, Norwegian vernacular. Everything is wood. Buildings are wood, spoons are wood, shoes are wood. Where a single material can actually pass through all the implements, all the tools, the outfittings of a city, and unify it into a kind of culture. And this is the void of, this is one of those bayous. The project was funded by a Shell Oil Company. And the last project is, this project, I have to say, to me, my friend suggested that I publish it in Scientific American, in Popular Science, which is kind of a kids magazine. It's a geography project, I think. I mean, we did the legwork, and we did the research. We actually went farther in the buildings than I'm showing. I wasn't satisfied with them. But I still think it's a kind of urban project in urban geography. We're just showing massing envelopes. And what we wanted to do is transform it into architecture. To do that, we shifted sites. This is a project that we did last year for the Biennale in Venice, which took a piece of Detroit by their request. They asked us to do 2 blocks. We did 250. We set up the structure. It was to replace this warehouse, this postal sorting house, which was on the Detroit River. This was the architecture that resulted from it in model form, which was to make that bridge. I don't want to just talk about making the bridge between architecture and urbanism, right? We kind of had to go through this step. We started transforming, just in the way I was showing you before, and much like Hilbersheimer in terms of stages of a reiteration of the infrastructure in a much more efficient configuration that allowed superblocks to be built and economies of scale. We started out with the renovation of the postal warehouse because we didn't want to throw out the building. It had 20 years of life left on it, so we renovated it. We found in Detroit a wonderful project, the Woodlands project, where they actually are planting trees as a form of controlling the blight. A company bought up a bunch of land, blocks and blocks and blocks. They wanted to tractor farm it because they couldn't get any money out of it. And everyone around there just went berserk. So they came back and said, how about trees? I'll give it to you for 60 years. We won't cut them down. And this was a test stand. It fit within the carbon. They didn't talk about carbon, surprisingly enough. We did. But it gave us something to point to. And then we started building up the density. I think it'll be clear in following slides how this works. The model that I showed you is the one above the arrow, which was on the waterfront, which we were turning back into a form of wetland. And this I will not have time to go into. It's what makes it specifically architecture, is an attempt by us, and it looks, I'm not sure how you would receive it. It's an attempt to think through typology in some sense that would make sense in the contemporary urban environment. One of the problems that we have with types is that we can't stuff everything into simple forms like a shed or a tower. We need these hybrid forms, so we came up with a system of producing sets of forms, selection criteria that came from that, and an iterative system which I don't have time to explain. But in some ways is an attempt to think through type again, knowing that we need some version of type, some part that can contribute to a larger whole at some scale. We looked at it actually came from Richard Dawkins, who's an evolutionary biologist, and a couple of other sources. And here's some of looking at our different phasing and the insertion of the types. What we did is did a convention center / hotel and residential environment. That's an early stage. Here, by changing out these types, we could really manipulate density in a direct way, because one of the variants is type is you could take a neighboring type. They're all variants of each other. They're like a family, a very large family. You could easily switch out lower and higher densities. By phase 4, it gets to be here. We wanted to achieve economies of scale. So these big blocks can be built all at once, even though they're based on a 300-foot grid that can be built, and you can get the values of economies of scale that we're getting out of these damn things, right? That if you all didn't have this in your pocket, this would cost me $10,000. The fact that you have it in your pocket means it costs me $200. We need to achieve those economies. This was the process. I put it together in one image, a simulation of organic growth. We know this is going to be built fast. What we wanted to do is to simulate not the look of an aggregated city, which is the 3 examples that I gave you before, but actually the process of an aggregate city, to some way simulate that process in the formation. And it gives you this, we have a number of strategies that are working here. This one I pulled out because it was the one that looked most natural, or it looked like an aggregation that would otherwise be happening over time, but that we accelerated by using the methods that I was explaining. You can see this was important to us. The 4 quadrants are distinguishing themselves by orientation, right? Whether they are running this way and this way. These are housing quadrants. This is essentially a housing estate. And we accompany that by a little serious physical modeling. That's the final phase. This is the building, the mixed-use waterfront superblock. And we carried it all the way through in terms of using the cross-laminated timber, which has been engineered by SOM up to 50 stories. I think these are more like 40. We reintroduce mixed-use planning by width. So the wide sections are commercial. You step in one in their administrative or office. You step in another in their residential, which generated the plan. The shapes. Prefabrication, using the panel system. Parallax, I could spend more time with this. And it was a lovely model. It's about 10 feet long. And the laser cutting for the model cost $4,000. And that's it. Thank you very much. And you probably don't have time for questions. You've got to...
Maybe one or two? Or...
Sure. I'm happy to... I think you need to move on to other things.
Thank you, Albert, for telling dense research and lecture. We'll have time to take maybe one or two questions now, keeping in mind that Albert will still be with us maybe at 6 or 6:30 after the event, and that we can have discussions.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
So maybe just one or two questions right now, and if not, we'll do that at 6:30.
It's kind of a lot to digest, right? It's kind of a lot to digest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have one?
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
There's one thing at the back of my mind throughout your talk is the source of energy, that what feeds all of this, and how or whether the shape of the city and the shape of the buildings incorporate the question of sucking in whatever energy might be around.
I mean, I think most of the energy requirements are end-use energy and how we get per capita consumption down. And that's mostly channeled through the argument for density. The proven efficiencies that you get with energy, with density in terms of per capita use. There are a lot of different ways to fuel it. If we were to follow through on our interest in wood as a material that crosses a number of different planes of society, biofuels make a lot of sense. In that context, you could see adding biofuels to that, but we actually didn't limit it. We tried to leave its application as open as possible, meaning that it could be done as a public-private venture. It could be built. I mean, there's nothing here that couldn't be built technically today, right? And it could be fueled. It could draw off any number of sources of energy that didn't require us to specify it. But when you bring it up, I think it obviously makes sense. You could extrapolate out biofuels and wood. That would change the cycle of sequestration too. There's also the matter of energy in another sense, which is stored energy, which you have in a block of wood. There's wood stores the energy from the sun, right? It's an energy sink as well as carbon, and I think you can say that about some other materials, but none so much as wood, right? It really is a captured solar energy, and we appreciated it at that level too.
Thank you. Thank you for your response.
I would like, yes, please forgot my broken English.
That's
I
better
would like
than my broken French.
To comment your response about energy and wood. Well, I definitely defend the use of wood in nowadays constructions, especially in France, where wood is relatively a new material towards the USA. But you spoke about cross-laminated timber, which is, I think, the unique way to use wood in vertical buildings like you, as you described in your presentation. But the big issue with this kind of very high-tech using of wood material is their embodied energy.
There's what?
Embodied energy, the energy you need to
make it.
To make it. For example, in traditional carpentry, well, traditional woodwork, you need to build 1 meter cube of wood, about 80 kilowatt hour, and you need 10 times more to build in situ concrete. In situ concrete needs 800 kilowatts per hour. Yeah. But with CLT, with cross-laminated timber, you need 2 times more than in situ concrete, even more than in situ concrete, about 1,600 kilowatt per meter cube. So I don't get it. How can we build nowadays with very few energy vertical cities, even with wood?
Yeah, I think I don't know those numbers and how you equate the two, concrete and wood. I'd have to check those out because you may be destroying my life if they're actually true. But we do know that in the third dirtiest industry in terms of carbon emissions is concrete. Once you have any form of carbon market, concrete is going to go through the roof and wood is going to plummet, right? That I think you can kind of bank on. In other words, you're using, my frame of reference is a bit idealistically geared towards thinking through paying the price of carbon, right? Which means a carbon tax or cap and trade, right? Where carbon goes up, and which would skew your numbers, obviously, right? Because concrete would cost way more and be prohibitive. The other thing is that we don't want to just make the argument from energy calculations alone. We want to, for example, appreciate the fact that wood can store carbon and concrete can't, right? That wood is a living material. This is gonna sound corny. That wood, well, if you imagine the nastiest housing estate, right? Ugly tower blocks sitting on the lawn. Now, in your head, just your mind's imagination, imagine that they're made out of wood. It changes a lot, the model. When you think about the material, that has absolutely nothing to do with the cost, the relative cost. It would be great if that cost aligned, but because wood is a living material, because, as I was saying, it stores energy from the sun, and also stores carbon. These all lay outside the economic argument, which would, as you say, economics is like this, right? And especially in terms of building materials. If you've worked in an office, you know that one day the price of steel changes and you've got 2 weeks to turn it into a concrete building. It's hard to base a logic on the specific market calculations for any material at any given place in time. But I do think that the statistics won't tell the story. right? You can use statistics to undercut a story and undercut a project. It's very hard to use the statistics to make one, right? In other words, we don't want to launch a critique that does not end with an alternative. And that's where you get into a much more, how would you say, integrated notion, social, economic, material, environmental, that is sorted out in a project, which you can't really undo by pulling out one like a Jenga tower and the whole thing's going to crash down. Although I appreciate the precision, right?
Thanks.